Hello and welcome to the FATBOSS guide to Jadefire Masters in the Battle of Dazar'alor.
So this encounter has you fighting two bosses at once, a mage and a monk. They each have their own separate powerful abilities, but they'll also cast dangerous team attacks at certain points throughout the fight, which you have to deal with. The bosses do not share a health pool, and the raid must keep the monk at a lower health percentage than the mage to make sure that Harmonious Spirits doesn't kick in. This gives the monk a damage buff which gets more powerful the bigger the difference between the two bosses' health pool is, but only when the mage is lower than the monk, so all DPS should focus the monk throughout the fight whilst cleaving and multi-dotting the mage. Let's go over the monk abilities first. For the tanks, you're going to need to deal with a multi-sided strike. This teleports the tank above the encounter space before summoning several images around them. These images will then fly towards the tank, dealing a large amount of physical damage to them. However, if you are faced towards an image, you do not take the damage and you gain a small 30-second output buff. So when you are teleported up, make a note of what order the images spawned in and turn to face them in that order. They will pulse out a little bit of light just before they fly towards you, which can also help you see which one you need to face. Once you land back in the encounter space, you'll gain a 40-second 100% physical damage taken debuff. It's at this point the other tank needs to taunt the monk, so you can let this debuff expire. The monk will also rush away to a random place in the room and channel Whirling Jade Storm, which deals raid-wide ticking damage. You need someone in your raid to simply melee hit her to interrupt the cast. On Heroic, the monk will also occasionally spawn a Spirit of Zwenad. This ad will fixate on a random player, leaping on them occasionally, dealing splash damage to anyone within 5 yards. The ad's melee attacks also hurt a good amount, so you need to make sure that you are kiting it if it is fixated on you. All DPS on the raid should ideally switch to this ad. Most forms of CC work on it as well, so you'll want to use things like stuns just to keep it away from that player.
That's all it is for the monk. Moving on to the mage. Now the mage will not melee hit, instead it will just spam cast fireballs into the tank. This is a 15-second dot each time that you're hit. When the debuff does expire, it will explode, dealing raid-wide damage which is increased for each stack of the dot you had. So tanks want to taunt off one another each time their dot drops, as that way you'll keep the amount of stacks the debuff has when it explodes to a minimum. This is generally around the 5 to 7 stack mark, but it can be higher or lower depending on if the mage is casting a bunch of other abilities. Now the mage will occasionally teleport to a random spot in the room, apply a damage absorption shield to itself, and then cast Pyroblast at somebody. This Pyroblast does a crazy amount of damage and applies a nasty dot, so you really want to interrupt it. You must remove the damage absorb shield from the mage before kicking, as it does make the mage immune to interrupts. Although this shield isn't particularly large, we do recommend that all DPS make sure that at least the shield is broken just to be safe. Now for healers, the mage will apply Searing Embers debuffs to random players in the raid. These debuffs deal ticking damage over their duration and will explode if they're not dispelled before they expire, dealing a fair amount of raid damage. Now these debuffs will all have different durations, so healers should focus on dispelling the shortest duration ones first. Of course, if the raid does happen to be stacked, you can always get a priest to master spell this as well. Now on Heroic, the mage will spawn a couple of magma traps in random areas of the room. These traps will sit around forever until somebody runs into them. This deals a burst of fire damage and knocks them high into the air, high enough that the full damage will kill them unless they can mitigate it in some way. So the main problem with these magma traps is that they just get in the way. At several points in the fight you need to get somewhere and the magma traps will screw you if you don't keep on top of clearing them. Rogues and hunters are particularly good at this job as they can cloak or turtle and clear several all in one go because you won't even get knocked up. Mages, locks and monks can TP back down after taking the hit. You can also use things like blinks, charges, leaps or disengage style spells to stop your full damage as you land. Now once you have triggered a trap, you will get a permanent debuff which increases the damage you take from traps by 100%. With one stack, you can still take a trap as long as you're at full health, and of course you mitigate the full damage completely. 2 stacks will very likely kill you if you don't have a big enough damage reduction or immunity. This just forces the raid to spread the job of soaking the traps out amongst yourselves, unless of course you have a bunch of hunters and rogues.
Now throughout the fight the bosses gain energy. This energy is partially constant, but also partially tied to their current health percentages. Basically, the quicker you damage the bosses down, the quicker they'll gain energy. At certain energy thresholds they will cast a powerful ability. At 30 energy, 2 living bombs will appear. These bombs will constantly cast Explosion, dealing a burst of damage to the entire raid. They will also be rotating on the spot while shooting out a frontal beam. This beam does crazy high damage and must be avoided. Each bomb is surrounded by smoke, which actually creates a line of sight barrier and deals ticking damage to anyone that stands within it. The entire raid should stack up within a single living bomb and just nuke it down while staying within the line of sight to allow healers to dispel the mage's Searing Embers debuffs. Once one bomb is dead, the raid should then move to the next and do the same thing. Now some guilds opt to kill both living bombs at the same time with a split raid. This can work as long as you have a priest in each team ready to master spell if one particular group gets completely coated in the Searing Embers. Whilst dealing with these living bombs, of course, there are other mechanics going on, so you do need to keep an eye on them. Most notably, the magma traps, as they can spawn inside a living bomb. You're going to need to very quickly clear them, otherwise potentially you could get caught by the beam. And also, the Spirit of Swenad could potentially cleave on top of the raid, so be ready to kill that off over the bombs.
At 60 energy, the bosses will teleport the raid to one side of the room and they'll teleport to the other. A maze made of rings of peace will appear and fire swirlies will be randomly appearing throughout the room. The raid must travel through the maze to the bosses whilst dodging the swirlies and then break down the barrier. Once that's done, the fight will return to normal. Now the Ring of Peace walls can be bypassed by loads of class abilities. Blinks, double jumps, leaps and teleports, they all work. Warlock gateways can be a great way for the entire raid to skip a section of the maze. You can even sometimes bounce through the wall if you hit it with enough speed, such as with a disengage style ability. Now the barrier does consist of 4 parts, all of which share health. On Heroic, only one part of these will be attackable from the beginning. This will just slow down the rate in which you kill the barrier, as you won't be able to cleave multiple parts of it at once. Of course, this isn't a huge issue, there is no rush in this phase, but if you do want to speed it up, a player can pick up a Force Orb. Force Orbs will be scattered throughout the maze. Picking one up does slow you by 30%, but once you get to the barrier, you can right click on an inactive part of it to make it attackable, allowing the raid to cleave. As I said, this isn't mandatory, it's just a way of speeding things up. Now at 100 energy, the bosses will transform into a serpent and a phoenix. This will remove the mage's pyroblast ability and the monk's whirling jade storm ability. The mage will now be applying the fireball dot with its melee attacks, as well as it will just be dealing passive ticking damage to the entire raid. The monk will occasionally cast a breath, which leaves a bunch of fire on the ground on Heroic. The raid just needs to make sure they quickly sidestep the breath just to make sure you avoid the incoming damage. Now during this phase, you need to make sure you kill off the monk as soon as possible, using second pots and DPS cooldowns. This is especially important on Heroic, as the monk will target multiple people with multi-sided strike, rather than just the tank. Anyone picked up by this needs to quickly identify which images are even theirs and what order they spawned in so that they can face them correctly, something that can be pretty difficult to do with everyone else's images being so close by. If the raid is really struggling at this point, you may want to use Bloodlust here instead of at the beginning, but do note that some guilds have completely skipped the Living Bomb team attack by bursting through the boss's health pools at the beginning of the fight, something that might become the standard thing to do if it goes unchanged and players get better gear. But that's all we have time for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If this guide did help you out, then make sure you leave a like. And if you want a handy written guide to refer to during your raid, or you just want to read up on some of the more detailed info on this fight, then do go check out our guide over on Wowhead. A link for that can be found in the description below. Thank you very much for watching again, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching.